Clear out your office, Amelia. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Orion Crestwood's voice cut through the phone like ice, shattering what should have been the most beautiful morning of my life. I stood there in my wedding dress, 30 minutes before walking down the aisle, staring at my reflection in the hotel mirror as my world crumbled. 12 years. 12 years of 70-hour weeks, missed holidays, and building his empire from nothing. And he chose my wedding day, to destroy me. "You can't be serious," I whispered, my bouquet trembling in my free hand. "Security will collect your belongings Monday. Congratulations on your marriage, by the way." The line went dead. But what Orion didn't know was that 2 hours earlier, I'd signed a prenup that would become his worst nightmare. My name is Amelia Beckett, and this is how I turned my wedding day devastation into the most satisfying revenge of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The grand ballroom at Silver Pine Resort was supposed to be my fairy tale ending. White roses cascaded from crystal chandeliers, and 200 guests were already seated in gold-trimmed chairs, waiting for me to walk down that ivory carpet toward the altar where my fiancé Daniel waited. Outside the bridal suite windows, Lake Harmony sparkled in the morning sun, and everything looked perfect. I should have been nervous about the ceremony, worried about my vows, or excited about the honeymoon in Tuscany we'd planned for months. Instead, I was on a work call at 9:47 a.m. on my wedding day, because that's who I was. That's who I'd always been for Orion Crestwood. The call was supposed to be quick. Just a final check on the quarterly projections before I disappeared for 2 weeks. Orion had insisted it was urgent, that the board meeting Monday required last-minute adjustments to the Whitmore acquisition numbers. I should have known better. In 12 years of working for him, Orion had never called anything urgent unless it directly benefited him. "The projections look solid," I'd told him, scrolling through spreadsheets on my laptop while my makeup artist waited patiently to touch up my lipstick. "The Whitmore deal should close by month-end, bringing us 47% above target for Q4. About that, Orion's voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "There's been a change of plans." That's when he delivered the blow that shattered my perfect morning. I'd started working for Crestwood Industries when I was 23, fresh out of college with a business degree and stars in my eyes. The company was just a mid-sized consulting firm then, headquartered in a modest building in downtown Millbrook with barely 30 employees. Orion was 35, charismatic, and had big dreams about revolutionizing corporate strategy consulting. He hired me as his assistant, but within 6 months I was doing the work of a senior analyst. Within 2 years, I was essentially running operations while he focused on bringing in new clients. I didn't mind. I loved the challenge, the responsibility, the feeling that I was building something important. I worked weekends when everyone else went home to their families. I flew to client meetings on holidays. I missed my college roommate's wedding because Orion needed me to handle a crisis with our biggest account. I missed my father's 60th birthday party because we were pitching to a Fortune 500 company that couldn't reschedule. "Amelia is irreplaceable," Orion used to tell people. "This company would fall apart without her." For 12 years I believed him. I believed I was valued, respected, essential. I watched Crestwood Industries grow from that small consulting firm into a billion-dollar corporation with offices in 6 states. I negotiated the deals that made us millions. I designed the operational systems that allowed us to scale. I identified the acquisition targets that transformed us from a regional player into a national powerhouse. And through it all, Orion promised that my loyalty would be rewarded. "When we go public, Amelia, you'll have more stock options than you know what to do with," he'd say. "You're not just an employee, you're family." Family. The word that kept me working through pneumonia, through my mother's cancer treatments, through the slow death of 3 serious relationships, because I was never available, never present, always choosing Crestwood Industries over everything else. The irony wasn't lost on me that Daniel, my fiancé, was one of the few men who understood my dedication to work. As a surgeon, he knew about impossible hours and life-or-death responsibilities. "When you find your life's work," he told me during our engagement, "everything else has to fit around it." But even Daniel had his limits. 3 weeks ago, he'd sat me down for a conversation that terrified me more than any board presentation ever had. Co. Amelia, I love you, but I need to know that after we're married, I won't always come second to Orion Crestwood, he'd said quietly. I need to know that our family will matter as much to you as that company does. I'd promised him things would change. That after the wedding, after the honeymoon, I'd set better boundaries. Maybe even negotiate a partnership position that would give me more control over my schedule. Orion respects me, I'd assured Daniel. He'll understand that I need better work-life balance. 12 years of loyalty has to count for something. How naive I was. Standing in that bridal suite, still in shock from the phone call, I tried to piece together what had just happened. Terminated. Effective immediately, on my wedding day. My bridesmaids were chattering outside the door, completely unaware that my world had just imploded. My phone kept buzzing with congratulatory texts from colleagues who had no idea they were wishing me well for a marriage that was starting with professional devastation. I called Orion back. It went straight to voicemail. I called his office. His secretary, Janet, sounded genuinely confused. Oh, Amelia, congratulations on your big day. Mr. Crestwood is in meetings all morning, but I can. Janet, did he mention anything about my employment status? A long pause. What do you mean? Never mind. Thank you. I hung up and stared at my reflection in the floor-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was unrecognizable. 12 years of my life had just been erased with a 30-second phone call, and I had no idea why. But I did know one thing. In 2 hours, I had signed a prenuptial agreement that Daniel's lawyer had insisted on. A prenup that included very specific clauses about intellectual property, business ventures, and information acquired during our marriage. At the time, it had seemed like a formality. Now, it felt like providence. Outside my door, someone called out, 5 minutes, Amelia. The processional is about to start. I took a deep breath, straightened my veil, and picked up my bouquet. Orion Crestwood thought he could destroy me on the happiest day of my life. He had no idea what he'd just started. The wedding march began, and I had exactly 30 seconds to decide whether to fall apart or hold myself together. 200 guests were standing, waiting for me to appear. Daniel was at the altar, probably wondering where I was. My father was outside the door, ready to walk me down the aisle he'd dreamed of since I was 5 years old. But all I could hear was Orion's voice echoing in my head. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. I made the only choice I could. I walked. The next 4 hours were the most surreal of my life. I smiled for photos while my career burned in the background. I said my vows while calculating how I'd pay my mortgage without my salary. I danced with my father while wondering if I'd have to sell the house my mother had loved before she died. You look radiant, sweetheart, Dad whispered during our dance. Mom would have been so proud. I almost lost it then. Mom had been so excited about my success at Crestwood Industries. She'd bragged to her book club about her daughter, the executive, who worked with Fortune 500 companies and flew first class to business meetings. My Amelia is building something important, she'd say. She's going to change the world. Now what was I? A woman in a wedding dress with no job and no idea why. Daniel sensed something was wrong during our first dance as husband and wife. You're tense, he murmured against my ear. Pre-wedding jitters finally hitting? I forced a smile. Just overwhelmed. It's been a big day. How could I tell him that my entire professional life had just been destroyed? How could I explain that the woman he'd married was suddenly unemployed and had no idea why? This was supposed to be our perfect beginning, not the start of a crisis. The reception continued around me like a beautiful, expensive blur. Guests clinked champagne glasses and gave heartfelt speeches about love and new beginnings. My college roommate Sarah tearfully recalled how I'd always said I'd rather be respected than loved, and how finding Daniel had taught me I could have both. If only she knew that half of that equation had just evaporated. I excused myself between the salad and main courses, claiming I needed to touch up my makeup. Instead, I locked myself in the resort's luxurious powder room and called my direct supervisor, Kelvin Sterling, Orion's VP of Operations. Amelia? Kelvin sounded genuinely shocked to hear from me. Aren't you supposed to be getting married right now? Kelvin, did you know about this? About my termination? A long, uncomfortable silence. What are you talking about? Orion called me this morning, said my employment was terminated immediately. Please tell me this is some kind of mistake. Another pause, longer this time. When Kelvin spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. Amelia, I think you should enjoy your wedding day. We can discuss this when you get back from your honeymoon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So you do know something. I can't. Look, just enjoy today. We'll figure this out later. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Kelvin knew. Whatever was happening, it wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was planned, coordinated, deliberate. How? I splashed cold water on my wrists, trying to calm down, before returning to my own reception. In the mirror, I looked perfect. Hair in an elegant updo, makeup flawless, designer gown that had cost more than some people's cars. But behind my eyes, I could see the panic starting to build. The financial implications hit me in waves throughout the evening. My salary was $340,000 a year, plus bonuses that usually brought my total compensation close to $500,000. I had savings, but not enough to maintain my lifestyle indefinitely. My mortgage on the house in Westbrook Hills was $8,200 a month. My car payment, insurance, utilities, the various subscriptions and memberships that came with executive life. It all added up to a cost of living that required my Crestwood Industries income. But worse than the money was the professional devastation. I had no other marketable skills beyond what I'd learned at Crestwood. My entire career, my entire professional identity was built around that company. My network, my reputation, my expertise, it was all tied to Orion and the empire we'd built together. Who was I without Crestwood Industries? I'd worked there for more than a third of my life. I'd never had another real job, never built professional relationships outside that ecosystem. Orion had been my mentor, my reference, my gateway to everything I'd achieved. Now he was my destroyer. To I die. During the cake cutting, while Daniel and I smiled for the photographer, I did the math in my head. If I couldn't find a comparable position quickly, I had maybe 6 months before I'd have to start making serious lifestyle changes. A year before, I'd have to consider selling the house. But finding a comparable position would be nearly impossible if Orion decided to poison the well. In our industry, his word carried enormous weight. If he told people I was difficult, unreliable, or had performance issues, I'd be unemployable at the executive level. The worst part was not knowing why. In 12 years, I'd never had a negative performance review. I'd exceeded every target, solved every crisis, delivered every project on time and under budget. Just 6 months ago, Orion had publicly praised my work at the company's annual meeting. Amelia Beckett is the backbone of this organization, he'd said to thunderous applause. Her strategic thinking and operational excellence have been instrumental in our success. What had changed between then and now? As the evening wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, I felt like I was watching my life from outside my body. People hugged me and Daniel, telling us how beautiful the wedding was, how perfect we looked together, how excited they were for our future. Our future. Daniel and I had talked about starting a family within the next 2 years. We discussed buying a bigger house, maybe something with a pool and a proper home office for both of us. We'd made plans based on the assumption that my career was secure, that my income was reliable. Now everything was uncertain. "You've been quiet tonight," Daniel said as we finally made it to the honeymoon suite. "Are you okay?" I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to collapse into his arms and let him help me figure out what to do next. But this was our wedding night. This was supposed to be magical, romantic, the beginning of our happily ever after. "I'm perfect," I lied, kissing him softly. "Just tired. It's been a long day." He smiled and pulled me closer. The best long day of my life. As I fell asleep in my new husband's arms, with my wedding dress hanging carefully in the closet and my engagement ring sparkling on my finger, one thought kept running through my mind. Orion Crestwood had underestimated me before, and it had made him very wealthy. This time, his underestimation was going to cost him everything. The Villa Serenata in Tuscany was everything Daniel and I had dreamed of for our honeymoon. Rolling hills covered in vineyards, ancient stone buildings glowing golden in the afternoon sun, and an infinity pool that seemed to spill into the Mediterranean horizon. It should have been paradise. Instead, I spent our first morning there staring at legal documents while my new husband slept peacefully beside me. I hadn't been able to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Orion's voice. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately." By 5 a.m., I gave up and took the prenuptial agreement out to the villa's terrace with a cup of espresso, determined to understand every word of the document I'd signed in such a rush. Daniel's lawyer, Harrison Webb, had insisted on the prenup. "It's not about trust," he'd explained during our meeting 3 weeks before the wedding. "It's about protecting both of your interests, especially given your high-earning positions and the likelihood that you'll both continue building wealth throughout your marriage." At the time, I'd skimmed through it quickly, focused more on wedding planning than legal details. The standard stuff was there. Separate property acquired before marriage remains separate. Joint property acquired during marriage gets split equitably. Spousal support limitations. But as I read more carefully in the early morning Tuscan light, I found clauses I'd forgotten about. Section 12.3 stopped me cold. Any intellectual property, business strategies, proprietary information, or trade secrets acquired by either party during the course of their employment, and subsequently developed or expanded upon during the marriage, shall be considered joint marital property, with both parties having equal rights to said intellectual property and any resulting profits or benefits. I read it 3 times before the implications hit me. Everything I'd created at Crestwood Industries over the past 12 years, every strategy, every operational system, every client relationship I'd built, if I could prove I'd continued to develop or refine those ideas after my marriage, they would be considered joint property, which meant Daniel would have legal rights to them too. But more importantly, it meant I would have legal standing to claim ownership of work I'd done, ideas I'd generated, systems I'd created. My hands were shaking as I continued reading. Section 14.7 was even more interesting. Both parties agreed to full financial disclosure throughout the marriage. Either party may request access to employment records, business communications, and financial documents related to the other party's professional activities for the purposes of tax planning, estate planning, or legal protection. Full financial disclosure, access to business communications. My phone buzzed with a text from my maid of honor, Lindsay Reed. "Hope you're having an amazing honeymoon. Saw something weird though. Orion just announced the Whitmore acquisition is being handled by some new consultant. Thought you were leading that project?" The Whitmore acquisition. The $47 million deal I'd been negotiating for 8 months. The project I'd told Orion was ready to close when he called me on my wedding day. I called Lindsay immediately, not caring that it was barely dawn in Italy. "Amelia, you're supposed to be honeymooning, not working," she laughed. "Lindsay, what exactly did you hear about Whitmore?" Her voice grew serious. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but my firm is handling some of the legal work. Word is that Crestwood brought in an outside consultant to fresh eyes the deal. Someone named Peregrine Thorne, from Meridian Strategic Group." Peregrine Thorne. I'd never heard the name, but Meridian Strategic Group was Crestwood's biggest competitor. Why would Orion bring in a competitor to handle a deal I'd already negotiated? "Lindsay, when was this consultant brought in?" "From what I heard? Yesterday, like literally the day after your wedding." The pieces started falling into place. Orion hadn't just fired me, he'd immediately replaced me with someone from a rival firm, someone who would have access to all my work, all my client relationships, all the strategies I'd developed over 12 years. "Lindsay, I need a favor. Can you find out more about this Peregrine Thorne? Quietly?" "Amelia, what's going on? You sound strange." I took a deep breath. Orion fired me. On my wedding day. And now he's handing my projects to competitors. The silence on the other end was deafening. "He what? That's insane. Why would he do that?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." After hanging up, I sat in the growing morning light, my mind racing. The prenup gave me legal rights I hadn't realized I had. The timing of my firing and the immediate replacement with a competitor suggested something bigger was happening. I opened my laptop and started searching for Peregrine Thorne online. His LinkedIn profile showed an impressive resume. Harvard MBA, 15 years of experience in strategic consulting, currently senior partner at Meridian Strategic Group. His specialization? Corporate restructuring and acquisition strategy. Corporate restructuring. A terrible thought began forming in my mind. What if my firing wasn't about my performance at all? What if it was about something bigger, something that required removing me from the equation before it happened? I started thinking about the conversations I'd had with Orion over the past few months, the private meetings he'd been having with board members, the questions he'd been asking about client contracts and their termination clauses, the way he'd been pushing me to document all my processes and procedures for efficiency. My phone rang. Daniel, finally awake. Good morning, beautiful. Where did you disappear to? Just getting some air. The sunrise is incredible out here. Come back to bed. This is our honeymoon, remember? No work, no phones, no stress. I'll be right there, I said, but I was already opening another browser window. Meridian Strategic Group had been in the news recently. I found 3 articles from the past month about their aggressive expansion strategy. They'd been acquiring smaller consulting firms, absorbing their client lists, and hiring away top talent from competitors. The last article, dated just 2 weeks ago, made my blood run cold. Meridian Strategic Group sets sights on billion-dollar acquisition targets in consulting sector. Orion wasn't just firing me, he was positioning Crestwood Industries to be acquired by Meridian. And I, with my deep knowledge of our client relationships, our operational secrets, and our financial vulnerabilities, was a liability that needed to be removed. But here's what he didn't know. The prenup I'd signed that morning gave me legal rights to everything I'd built at that company. And if I could prove that Crestwood Industries was being sold using strategies and relationships I'd developed, I might have a claim to a portion of that sale. More importantly, if I could prove that my firing was part of a deliberate plan to defraud me of compensation I was owed, I might have grounds for a lawsuit that could expose the entire scheme. I looked out over the Tuscan countryside, watching the sun climb higher into a cloudless sky. For the first time since that devastating phone call, I felt something other than despair. I felt hope. And something else. Something cold and calculating that I'd never felt before. I felt dangerous. Daniel appeared on the terrace in his pajama pants, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a concerned expression. You've been out here for 2 hours. What's so important that it couldn't wait until after our honeymoon? I closed my laptop and smiled at my new husband. Just some paperwork I needed to review, nothing that can't wait. It wasn't entirely a lie. What I'd discovered could wait, but not for long. Orion thought he'd destroyed me on my wedding day. He'd actually just given me the weapons I needed to destroy him. The remaining 5 days of our honeymoon became the most intensive research project of my life. While Daniel explored Tuscan wineries and historical sites, I buried myself in legal databases, corporate filings, and financial records, claiming I had a few work loose ends to tie up before we returned home. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have work to do, just not the kind Daniel imagined. I started with Meridian Strategic Group's public filings. As a publicly traded company, they had to disclose their major acquisitions, strategic plans, and financial projections. What I found painted a clear picture of aggressive expansion funded by private equity backing from Blackstone Capital, one of the most ruthless investment firms in the industry. Their acquisition strategy was sophisticated and predatory. They would identify successful mid-market consulting firms, infiltrate them by hiring away key personnel or planting consultants for collaborative projects, extract proprietary information about operations and client relationships, then make acquisition offers that the target companies couldn't refuse or compete against. The pattern was always the same: infiltrate, extract, acquire, absorb. And according to their quarterly investor calls, Crestwood Industries had been on their target list for 18 months. I found the smoking gun in Meridian's Q2 investor presentation, filed just 6 weeks before my wedding. Slide 47 listed priority acquisition targets with projected timelines. There it was, Crestwood Industries Est. Acquisition Q for 2024. Projected value $2.1 billion. Integration timeline, 6 months. My hands were shaking as I screenshot the slide. They'd been planning to acquire my company for over a year, and the timeline suggested the deal was already in motion. But I needed to understand my own legal position before I could do anything with this information. I spent an entire day researching intellectual property law, employment contracts, and prenuptial agreements. What I learned was both encouraging and terrifying. Under normal circumstances, everything I'd created at Crestwood Industries would belong to the company. But the prenup I'd signed created an unusual legal framework. If I could prove that I had continued to develop, refine, or expand upon ideas and strategies after my marriage, even during my honeymoon, those developments could be considered joint marital property. More importantly, the full financial disclosure clause gave me legal standing to demand access to any communications or documents related to Daniel's or my professional activities. Since my professional activities had been suddenly terminated under suspicious circumstances, I could potentially compel Orion to provide documentation about the decision-making process. But the real weapon was Section 18.2, which I'd missed on my first reading. Either party may pursue legal action to protect marital assets from fraudulent or deceptive business practices that could impact the financial security of the marriage. If I could prove that my firing was part of a scheme to defraud me of compensation I was legally owed, Daniel and I together could sue not just for damages but for a portion of any financial benefit that resulted from the misuse of my work. That's when I started digging into Peregrine Thorne's background more deeply. His LinkedIn profile was impressive, but something felt off about the timeline. He'd listed his start date at Meridian as January 2024, but I found news articles mentioning him as a Meridian partner dating back to 2021. Why would he misrepresent his tenure? I searched for any connection between Thorne and Crestwood Industries. It took hours of cross-referencing conference attendee lists, professional association memberships, and board positions, but finally I found it. Thorne had served on the advisory board of the Strategic Consulting Alliance, the same industry association where Orion had been a keynote speaker 8 months ago. They'd been in the same room, they'd likely met, networked, maybe even had private conversations about the industry. Now, the timeline was becoming clearer. Meridian had identified Crestwood as an acquisition target. They'd made contact with Orion through industry channels. They'd probably offered him a substantial role in the combined company, maybe even CEO of the consulting division, in exchange for facilitating a smooth acquisition. But there was a problem. Me. I knew too much about Crestwood's actual value. I had built most of the client relationships personally. I understood which contracts were solid and which were vulnerable. Most importantly, I'd been involved in strategic planning discussions that would have revealed any acquisition talks. I was a liability that needed to be eliminated before the deal could proceed. My phone buzzed with another text from Lindsay. More weird stuff happening. Heard through the grapevine that Orion's been having a lot of, quote, private meetings with board members. Also, did you know he put his Hamptons house on the market? Orion's Hamptons house was his pride and joy. A $4.2 million oceanfront property he'd bought during our most profitable year and loved to use for client entertainment. He'd never sell it unless he was either in serious financial trouble or planning to buy something much more expensive. Like a bigger house with the proceeds from selling Crestwood Industries. I called my former assistant, Janet, on her personal phone. Janet, it's Amelia. I know this is awkward, but I need to ask you something confidential. Oh, honey, I heard what happened. I'm so sorry. Nobody understands why Mr. Crestwood would let you go, especially on your wedding day. Janet, in the weeks before my wedding, did Orion have any unusual meetings? Anyone you didn't recognize? A pause. Well, there was that man who came in several times. Said he was from some consulting firm wanting to discuss partnership opportunities. Mr. Crestwood always met with him privately, told me not to put the meetings on his calendar. Do you remember the man's name? Something unusual. Perry something? Or maybe it started with a P. Peregrine? That's it, Peregrine something. He had an expensive suit, and one of those fancy watches that cost more than my car. Peregrine Thorne had been meeting privately with Orion for weeks before my wedding. Before my firing. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that firing me would eliminate the threat I posed. They'd assumed I'd quietly disappear, maybe sign a non-disclosure agreement, and never challenge what they were doing. They hadn't counted on the prenup giving me legal weapons they didn't know existed. That evening, as Daniel and I shared dinner on our villa's terrace, I watched the sunset paint the Tuscan hills gold and realized something had fundamentally changed inside me. A week ago, I'd been a loyal employee who trusted that hard work and dedication would be rewarded. I'd been naive, trusting, willing to sacrifice everything for a company that saw me as disposable. Sec. Now I was something else entirely. I was someone who understood how power really worked, how betrayal was just another business strategy, how loyalty was a weakness that ruthless people exploited. "You seem different," Daniel said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "More focused, determined." I smiled at my husband, this good man who'd married me, thinking he was getting a successful executive with a stable career. He'd actually married someone who was about to declare war on a billion-dollar corporation. "I'm just excited about our future," I told him. "I think we're going to build something amazing together." It wasn't a lie. We were going to build something amazing. We were going to build Orion Crestwood's complete destruction. The flight back to New York gave me 8 uninterrupted hours to plan my next move. While Daniel slept beside me, I stared out at the Atlantic Ocean 35,000 feet below and considered my options. I had evidence of a conspiracy, legal weapons I hadn't known existed, and a burning need for justice. But I also had something more valuable than all of that. I had learned from other people's mistakes. Over the past week, I'd researched every major corporate whistleblower case from the last decade. The pattern was always the same. Good people with solid evidence went to the authorities expecting justice, only to be destroyed by legal teams with unlimited resources and no ethical boundaries. Take Rebecca Morrison, the Entech Industries executive who'd exposed a massive accounting fraud in 2019. She'd done everything right, documented evidence, followed proper channels, cooperated with federal investigators. The company was eventually fined $200 million, but Rebecca? Her career was obliterated. Entech's legal team painted her as mentally unstable, highlighted every personal mistake she'd ever made, and systematically destroyed her reputation. She ended up unemployable, bankrupt from legal fees, and living in her sister's spare bedroom. Or consider Marcus Chen, the pharmaceutical executive who'd exposed dangerous drug trial cover-ups. His evidence saved lives and led to congressional hearings, but he paid for his courage with years of litigation, death threats, and complete professional exile. The last interview I could find with him was from 2021, where he was working as a night shift security guard and said he regretted ever speaking up. The system wasn't designed to protect people like me, it was designed to protect people like Orion. But I had advantages that other whistleblowers hadn't possessed. First, I wasn't trying to expose wrongdoing for moral reasons. I was trying to recover compensation that was legally mine. Second, I had the prenup, which gave me legal standing that most whistleblowers lacked. And third, I understood corporate strategy better than most people who'd tried to take on billion-dollar companies. Connor, I wasn't going to make their mistakes. My first instinct had been to go directly to the SEC with evidence of the acquisition conspiracy. Show them Meridian's investor presentations, Orion's secret meetings with Thorne, the suspicious timing of my termination. Let federal investigators handle the corporate fraud while I focused on my personal lawsuit. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that approach would fail. Orion would immediately claim that my firing was performance-related, that I was a disgruntled employee making false accusations. He'd produce whatever documentation he needed to support that narrative, and I'd be stuck trying to prove a negative. My second thought was to go public. Contact financial journalists, leak the story to business media, create enough public pressure that Orion couldn't proceed with the acquisition quietly. But that approach had its own risks. Orion controlled the narrative at Crestwood Industries. He could easily discredit me as a fired employee with questionable motives, especially since I had no allies inside the company to corroborate my story. Going directly to Orion himself was another option. Confront him with what I knew, demand reinstatement and proper compensation, threaten to expose the acquisition plan if he didn't comply. But that would only give him time to cover his tracks and prepare defenses. Plus, it assumed he cared about my opinion or felt any obligation to treat me fairly, assumptions that my wedding day firing had definitively disproved. No, I needed a different approach, something that would give me maximum leverage while protecting me from retaliation. I thought about the most successful corporate battles I'd witnessed during my career. The winners weren't the people with the best evidence or the strongest moral arguments. They were the people who understood that corporate warfare was about timing, positioning, and controlling multiple pressure points simultaneously. They were the people who made their opponents fight on multiple fronts while protecting their own vulnerabilities. That's when I realized what I needed to do. I wouldn't choose just one approach. I'd use all of them, but in a carefully orchestrated sequence that would make it impossible for Orion to respond effectively. Phase 1 would be building an unassailable legal position. I'd use the Prenup's disclosure provisions to demand access to all communications related to my employment termination and the Meridian negotiations. If Orion refused, I'd have grounds for immediate legal action. If he complied, I'd have documentary evidence of the conspiracy. Phase 2 would be identifying and recruiting allies. Other Crestwood employees who might be harmed by the acquisition, board members who weren't part of the conspiracy, clients who had personal relationships with me rather than with the company. I needed people who could corroborate my story and who had their own reasons to oppose what Orion was doing. Phase 3 would be strategic media engagement. Not wild accusations or emotional appeals, but carefully timed leaks that would create pressure at key moments in the acquisition timeline. Financial journalists loved stories about corporate betrayal, especially when they involved respected executives being stabbed in the back. Phase 4 would be direct legal action, but only after I'd positioned myself for maximum advantage. By then, I'd have evidence, allies, public attention, and legal momentum. Orion would be fighting battles on multiple fronts while I controlled the timing and narrative. But the most important element of my strategy wasn't tactical. It was psychological. I needed to become someone Orion couldn't predict or control. For 12 years, he'd known exactly how I'd react to any situation. I was reliable, loyal, conflict-averse. I followed proper channels and respected authority. That version of Amelia Beckett was dead. She'd died in a hotel room on her wedding day when her boss destroyed her life with a 30-second phone call. The new Amelia Beckett was someone else entirely. Someone who understood that loyalty was a liability, that trust was a weapon other people used against you, and that the only security came from being too dangerous to attack. As our plane began its descent into JFK Airport, I made my final decision. I wasn't going to seek justice. Justice was what powerful people gave you when it was convenient for them. I wasn't going to seek revenge. Revenge was emotional and messy and ultimately unsatisfying. I was going to seek victory. Complete, total, unambiguous victory that would leave Orion Crestwood professionally destroyed and personally humiliated. And I was going to do it using the very skills he'd taught me. Good flight? Daniel asked, stretching as he woke up. Perfect, I said, closing my laptop and smiling at him. I'm excited to get home and start our new life together. He squeezed my hand. Any regrets about taking time off work? I know how important your career is to you. I looked out the window at New York City spread out below us, millions of lights twinkling in the gathering dusk. Somewhere down there, Orion Crestwood was probably celebrating his brilliant plan to eliminate me and sell the company I'd helped him build. He had no idea that I was coming for him. No regrets at all, I told my husband. I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Monday morning, I woke up in my own bed for the first time as a married woman and an unemployed executive. Daniel had already left for an early surgery, kissing me goodbye and whispering that he loved how relaxed I looked after our honeymoon. If only he knew that my apparent calm was actually the focused intensity of someone preparing for war. My first call was to Harrison Webb, Daniel's lawyer who drafted our prenup. I'd decided that complete honesty was the best approach. Harrison was bound by attorney-client privilege, and I needed someone who understood the legal weapons at my disposal. "Amelia, congratulations on the marriage," Harrison said when I reached him at his Midtown office. "I trust the honeymoon was everything you hoped for?" "It was enlightening in ways I didn't expect. Harrison, I need to discuss the prenup we signed, specifically the intellectual property and disclosure clauses." A pause. "That's unusual for a newlywed. Is there a problem?" "My employer terminated me on my wedding day, and I have reason to believe it was part of a conspiracy to facilitate a corporate acquisition. I think the prenup gives me legal standing to challenge what they're doing." Harrison's voice became immediately professional. "I think you should come in, this afternoon if possible." 2 hours later, I was sitting in Harrison's corner office overlooking Central Park, explaining everything I discovered. He listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad, his expression growing increasingly serious. "The intellectual property clause is broader than most people realize," he said when I finished. "If you can prove that strategies or relationships you developed at Crestwood continued to evolve during your marriage, even during your honeymoon, you have potential claims to any financial benefit derived from that work. And the disclosure provisions? Those are your immediate weapon. You can compel production of documents related to your termination and any business decisions that might affect your intellectual property rights. If they refuse, we can seek court orders." Harrison leaned back in his chair. "But Amelia, you need to understand what you're proposing. Taking on a billion-dollar corporation isn't just about legal rights. It's about resources, endurance, and public relations. They'll try to destroy you personally before they ever address your claims on the merits. That's why I need allies. People who have their own reasons to oppose what Orion is doing." "Do you have anyone in mind?" I'd spent Sunday night making a list. Several people, actually. My first target was Kelvin Sterling, Orion's VP of Operations and my former direct supervisor. Kelvin had been with Crestwood almost as long as I had, and he'd built his own relationships with key clients. If Meridian acquired the company, someone like Kelvin would likely be redundant. They'd want their own people in leadership positions. I called Kelvin from my car outside Harrison's office. "Amelia, how was the honeymoon? Listen, I'm so sorry about what happened. I tried to talk to Orion, but he said the decision was final." "Kelvin, we need to talk. Not at the office. Can you meet me for coffee?" We met at a small cafe in Tribeca, far from Crestwood's offices in Midtown. Kelvin looked uncomfortable from the moment he sat down. "Before you say anything," I began, "I want you to know that I understand you were put in an impossible position. But I also think you deserve to know what's really happening." I laid out everything. Meridian's acquisition plan, Peregrine Thorne's secret meetings with Orion. The timeline that showed my firing was coordinated with the takeover strategy. Kelvin's face went pale. "You're saying Orion is selling the company?" "I'm saying Orion has been negotiating to sell the company for months, and anyone who might complicate that sale is being eliminated." "But I just signed a new employment contract. Orion said we were expanding the operations division." "Kelvin, if Meridian acquires Crestwood, do you really think they'll need 2 VPs of operations? You've seen their other acquisitions. They absorb the client relationships and eliminate duplicate positions." I watched the realization dawn on his face. He wasn't just witnessing my destruction, he was next in line. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. "Access. You still have login credentials, email access, calendar visibility. I need to know who Orion is meeting with and when. I need copies of any documents related to acquisition discussions. That could be considered corporate espionage. It could also be considered protecting yourself from fraud. If Orion is negotiating your termination while telling you about expansion plans, that's deliberate deception." Kelvin was silent for a long moment. "Then, what kind of timeline are we talking about?" "Based on Meridian's investor presentations, they want to close the deal by year-end. That gives us maybe 10 weeks. He nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can find." My second ally was someone I'd never expected to recruit. Dahlia Hayes, Orion's ex-wife. Dahlia and Orion had divorced 3 years earlier in a spectacular battle that had been covered in the business press. She'd accused him of hiding assets during their separation, and while she'd eventually received a substantial settlement, She'd always maintained that Orion had defrauded her of millions more. I found her at her art gallery in Soho, an elegant space showcasing contemporary sculpture. Dahlia was exactly as I remembered from company events, striking, sophisticated, and sharp as a blade. "Amelia Beckett," she said when I introduced myself. "I remember you. Orion's devoted lieutenant. Congratulations on your recent marriage, by the way. I heard he fired you on your wedding day. Even for Orion, that's impressively cruel." "That's actually why I'm here. I think what he did to me is connected to what he did to you." Dahlia's eyebrows rose. "How so?" "I think he's been systematically hiding assets and planning for a major liquidity event. If I'm right, the money he claimed he didn't have during your divorce is about to become very visible." I spent 20 minutes explaining the Meridian acquisition, the timeline, and my theory that Orion had been positioning himself financially for years. "If Crestwood sells for the numbers I'm seeing in Meridian's projections," I concluded, "Orion could personally receive anywhere from $200 to $400 million, depending on his equity stake." Dahlia's smile was predatory. "That would certainly constitute concealment of assets during our divorce proceedings. My settlement was based on financial disclosures that might have been deliberately understated. Would you be willing to challenge those disclosures if new evidence became available?" "Amelia, I've been waiting 3 years for an opportunity to prove that my ex-husband is a lying, manipulative fraud. If you can give me evidence that he concealed his plans for this acquisition during our divorce, I'll not only challenge the settlement, I'll make sure every business journalist in New York knows exactly how Orion Crestwood treats the people who trust him." My third and most important ally was someone I'd worked with at Crestwood's biggest client, Hestia Vale, the chief strategy officer at Pinnacle Financial Group. Hestia and I had developed a close working relationship over 5 years, and she'd specifically requested that all Pinnacle projects be handled through me rather than other Crestwood staff. Pinnacle Financial represented about 30% of Crestwood's annual revenue. If Hestia decided to terminate their contract, it would be devastating to any acquisition plan. I called her Tuesday morning. "Amelia, I heard some disturbing rumors about your status at Crestwood. Please tell me they're not true." "They're true. Orion terminated me last Friday, and I think you deserve to know why." I met Hestia for lunch at her private club on the Upper East Side. She listened intently as I explained the acquisition conspiracy, but what really got her attention was the timeline. "So you're telling me that Orion has been negotiating to sell Crestwood while simultaneously pitching us on a 3-year strategic partnership extension?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. The partnership extension was probably designed to make Crestwood more attractive to Meridian locked-in revenue from a premium client." Hestia's expression was ice cold. "We just signed that extension last month. If Orion was planning to sell the company, that constitutes material misrepresentation of Crestwood's intentions." "It gets worse. Peregrine Thorne, the Meridian consultant who's now handling your account, probably has access to all your proprietary information and strategic plans. Information that could be valuable to Meridian's other clients, including Pinnacle's competitors. That," Hestia said quietly, "would be a breach of contract that could cost Crestwood tens of millions in damages." By the end of that week, I had assembled a coalition that Orion couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares. A VP who could provide inside information, an ex-wife with legal grounds to challenge the acquisition proceeds, and a major client with the power to destroy the deal entirely. But most importantly, I had Harrison Webb, who was already drafting the legal demands that would force Orion to reveal everything. On Friday night, as Daniel and I shared dinner in our apartment, he asked how my first week of unemployment was going. "Productive," I said. "I'm working on a new project, something that could be very lucrative for both of us." "What kind of project?" I smiled at my husband, this good man who had no idea he'd married someone capable of corporate warfare. "Let's just say I'm exploring some intellectual property opportunities that came up during our honeymoon." It wasn't a lie. I was exploring opportunities. I was exploring every opportunity to destroy Orion Crestwood. The first sign that Orion knew something was wrong came Tuesday morning of my second week as an unemployed executive. I was having coffee with Kelvin at our usual spot in Tribeca when his phone buzzed with an urgent text. "I have to go," he said, his face pale. Orion just called an emergency meeting with all senior staff. He wants to discuss, quote, internal security protocols. What kind of security protocols? The kind that happen when someone thinks there might be a leak. My stomach dropped. We'd been careful. Meeting away from the office, using personal phones, avoiding email entirely. But Orion hadn't built a billion-dollar company by being careless about threats. That afternoon, Kelvin called from his car. We have a problem. Orion hired a security consulting firm called Blackwater Intelligence. They're doing a comprehensive audit of all electronic communications, computer access logs, and physical building security. What's their timeline? They're starting tomorrow. And Amelia? They specifically mentioned they'll be reviewing any unusual patterns in document access or communication with former employees. I felt the walls closing in. What does that mean for you? It means I need to be very careful about what information I access from now on. And it means you should assume that everything we discuss could eventually be discovered. That evening, Harrison called with more bad news. Crestwood's legal team responded to our initial document requests. They're claiming attorney-client privilege on almost everything, and demanding that we provide more specificity about what intellectual property you're claiming rights to. Can they do that? They can try, but here's the bigger problem. They've retained Morrison, Kessler & Associates. I knew that name. Morrison Kessler was the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in New York. They specialized in destroying whistleblowers and burying scandals. If Orion had hired them, he wasn't just planning to fight my claims. He was planning to annihilate me personally. What does that mean for our timeline? It means they're going to try to drag this out while simultaneously attacking your credibility. They'll demand depositions, file motions to dismiss, challenge every piece of evidence. This could take years. Years I didn't have. Meridian's acquisition timeline was aggressive, and if they completed the deal before I could establish my claims, I'd be fighting a much larger, better-resourced enemy. Wednesday brought the next complication. Dahlia Hayes called, her voice tight with frustration. Orion's gotten to my divorce attorney, she said. Richard Blackstone just called to inform me that Orion's lawyers contacted him about irregularities in how our settlement was finalized. They're threatening to challenge the entire agreement if I pursue any action related to concealed assets. Can they do that? Legally? Probably not. But they can make it expensive and miserable. Richard is already talking about how much it would cost to defend against their challenges, and he's strongly advising me to avoid any actions that might, quote, provoke additional litigation. I was losing allies as quickly as I'd gained them. Orion was using the same strategy that had made him successful in business. Identify pressure points and attack them systematically until your opponents capitulate. Thursday's blow was the most devastating. Hestia Vale called from Pinnacle Financial with news that made my hands shake. Amelia, I need to tell you something confidential. Orion requested a meeting with our board yesterday. He told them that you've been making false accusations against Crestwood, and that you might try to interfere with our business relationship. What did your board say? They listened. And then Orion presented them with a very generous offer to expand our partnership at significantly reduced rates. He positioned it as Crestwood's way of ensuring continuity despite the, quote, unfortunate situation with a disgruntled former employee. I felt sick. Did they accept? They voted to table any decisions about our Crestwood relationship until they can conduct their own investigation. But Amelia, Orion was very persuasive. He had documentation of what he claimed were performance issues in your work, complaints from other clients, questions about your judgment, all of which are complete fabrications. I know that, but the board doesn't. And if they decide that maintaining the Crestwood partnership is more important than supporting your claims, I'll be powerless to help you. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the city lights, feeling like the walls were closing in from every direction. Orion wasn't just defending himself. He was systematically dismantling the coalition I'd built, using his superior resources and established relationships to isolate me. But the worst was yet to come. Haiti. Friday morning, Daniel got a call at the hospital. When he came home that evening, his face was grim. "Amelia, we need to talk." My heart stopped. "What's wrong?" "The hospital's legal department received a call today. Someone claiming to represent Crestwood Industries suggested that I might have conflicts of interest related to your, quote, employment disputes. They mentioned that our prenup could create ethical issues for my practice." "What kind of ethical issues?" "They suggested that I might have access to confidential information that could affect my investment decisions, or that our marriage might create improper financial incentives related to your legal claims." I felt rage building in my chest. "They're threatening your career because you married me." "It's more subtle than that. They're not making direct threats. They're just raising concerns and suggesting that the hospital might want to review my compliance with ethics policies." Daniel sat down beside me, taking my hands in his. "Amelia, I need to understand what's really happening here. This isn't just about a wrongful termination anymore, is it?" For the first time since my wedding day, I told him everything. The acquisition conspiracy, the evidence I'd gathered, the alliance I'd built, and the war won was fighting against a man who decided to destroy me. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly serious. "So you're telling me that you're taking on a billion-dollar corporation, with allies who are being systematically neutralized, while the other side has unlimited resources and no ethical boundaries?" "Yes." "And they're now threatening my career to pressure you to back down?" "Yes." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he squeezed my hands tighter. "What do you need me to do?" I stared at him, surprised. "You're not going to ask me to stop? Amelia, I married you because you're the strongest, most determined person I've ever met. If you think this fight is necessary, then we'll find a way to win it. But we need to be smarter about how we proceed." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Orion is playing the game by his rules, using his advantages. Maybe it's time to change the rules." That weekend, I realized Daniel was right. I'd been fighting on Orion's terms, using traditional corporate warfare tactics against someone who had superior resources for that kind of battle. But I had advantages he didn't understand. I had the prenup, which gave me legal rights he hadn't anticipated. I had evidence of his conspiracy that he didn't know I possessed. And most importantly, I had something he'd never had: the moral authority of someone who'd been genuinely wronged. It was time to stop playing defense and go on the attack. Monday morning, I called Harrison with new instructions. "I want you to file everything simultaneously. The intellectual property claims, the document production demands, the fraud allegations. All of it, all at once." "Amelia, that's going to trigger massive retaliation." "Good. Because while they're focused on attacking me, they won't see the real blow coming." "What real blow?" I smiled, thinking about the files I'd discovered on our honeymoon and the timeline I'd been building. "Harrison, what do you know about securities fraud investigations?" Harrison Webb's office had never felt more like a war room. The conference table was covered with documents, laptops, legal pads, and multiple phones. Charts showing corporate structure and financial flows covered one wall, while timeline graphics traced the conspiracy across another. It was Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after my initial conversation with Harrison, and we were preparing for the most important legal filing of my life. "Securities fraud is federal," Harrison explained, reviewing the documents we'd assembled. "If we can prove that Orion and Meridian manipulated Crestwood's value through deliberate misrepresentation while actively negotiating an acquisition, we're looking at SEC violations that could trigger criminal investigations. What do we need to prove that?" 3 elements: material misstatement of facts, intent to deceive investors or stakeholders, and financial harm resulting from that deception. He pointed to our evidence chart. "We have documentation of Orion's private communications with Meridian dating back 18 months. We have Meridian's internal projections showing they expected to acquire Crestwood at below market value. And we have evidence that Orion systematically eliminated employees who might have exposed the deal." I'd spent the weekend working with a forensic accountant Harrison had recommended, a former SEC investigator named Dr. Patricia Morrison, who specialized in uncovering hidden corporate relationships. Her analysis of public filings had revealed connections that even I hadn't suspected. "Look at this," Dr. Morrison said, sliding a thick report across the table. Meridian's private equity backers, Blackstone Capital, have financial relationships with 3 of Crestwood's board members through their other investments. Board member Thomas Whitfield sits on the advisory board of 2 companies that Blackstone has majority stakes in. Board member Sarah Chen received $2.3 million in, quote, consulting fees from a Blackstone subsidiary last year. What does that mean? It means the fix was in from the beginning. Orion didn't just negotiate this deal with Meridian. He coordinated with board members who had financial incentives to approve the acquisition, regardless of whether it was in Crestwood's best interests. Harrison leaned forward. That's conspiracy to breach fiduciary duty. If we can prove the board was financially compromised, the entire acquisition could be invalidated. But Dr. Morrison had found something even more damaging. Here's the smoking gun, she said, opening another folder. Meridian's Q3 investor call, recorded 6 weeks ago. The CEO specifically mentioned that they had, quote, internal intelligence about Crestwood's operational vulnerabilities and expected the acquisition to close well below market valuations due to strategic advantages in the negotiation process. I felt my pulse quicken. Strategic advantages in the negotiation process? Inside information. They're essentially admitting they had access to confidential Crestwood data that gave them an unfair advantage. That's textbook securities fraud. Harrison was already reaching for his phone. I'm calling the SEC whistleblower office. This kind of evidence triggers mandatory investigations. While Harrison made his calls, I reviewed the timeline we'd constructed. Everything finally made sense. 18 months ago, Meridian had identified Crestwood as an acquisition target. They'd cultivated relationships with compromised board members and begun negotiating preliminary terms. 12 months ago, they'd placed Peregrine Thorne in position for collaborative projects that gave him access to our operational data. 6 months ago, they'd finalized the deal structure, and 4 weeks ago, they'd begun eliminating potential obstacles, starting with me. The SEC is interested, Harrison announced, hanging up. They want a formal whistleblower complaint filed within 48 hours, with all supporting documentation. If their preliminary review confirms violations, they'll open a full investigation. What's the timeline for that? SEC investigations can take months or years, but they have emergency procedures for ongoing fraud. If they believe Meridian is actively manipulating market conditions, they can freeze assets and issue temporary restraining orders within days. That's when I realized the true power of what we'd discovered. Orion thought he was fighting a wrongful termination lawsuit from a disgruntled employee. He had no idea he was about to face federal securities fraud charges that could send him to prison. But timing was everything. Meridian's acquisition was scheduled to close in 6 weeks, according to their latest investor guidance. If the SEC moved fast enough, they could stop the deal entirely. If they moved too slowly, Orion and his co-conspirators would have liquidated their positions and disappeared with hundreds of millions in proceeds. Wednesday morning, I got a call that changed everything. It was Kelvin Sterling, and his voice was shaking. Amelia, you need to know something. Orion just had a private meeting with the board. He's accelerating the Meridian timeline. What do you mean accelerating? They're moving the closing date up to next Friday. 1 week from now. He told the board that market conditions were favorable and they needed to act quickly. My blood ran cold. Orion knew something was wrong. Maybe Blackwater Intelligence had detected unusual patterns in data access. Maybe one of our allies had been compromised. Maybe he was just paranoid. But somehow, he'd sensed the walls closing in. Kelvin, does the board have the authority to approve that kind of acceleration? With the votes he has secured, yes. Thomas Whitfield and Sarah Chen are already committed. He only needs one more board member to approve the timeline change. I hung up and immediately called Harrison. We have a problem. They're trying to close the deal next Friday. That's impossible. SEC investigations take time to develop. Even if we file the whistleblower complaint today, there's no guarantee they'll act fast enough to stop the closing. That's when I realized we needed to attack on multiple fronts simultaneously. The SEC investigation was crucial for long-term justice, but we needed immediate pressure to delay the closing. I spent Wednesday night making phone calls, activating every relationship I'd built over 12 years in the industry. By Thursday morning, I had commitments from 3 major financial journalists to investigate the story if I could provide them with exclusive access to the evidence. "This is dangerous," Harrison warned. "If you leak information to the media before the SEC investigation is complete, you could compromise the federal case. If we don't create immediate pressure, there won't be anything left for the SEC to investigate." Thursday afternoon, I made the call that terrified me most. I called Orion Crestwood directly. His assistant, Janet, sounded shocked to hear from me. "Oh, Amelia, how are you doing?" "I need to speak with Orion. Tell him it's about the Meridian situation. I'm not sure he's available." "Janet, tell him that if he doesn't take this call, the Wall Street Journal will receive a very interesting package of documents tomorrow morning." 3 minutes later, Orion's voice came through the phone, cold and controlled. "Hello, Amelia. I understand you've been busy since your termination." "Hello, Orion. I understand you've been busy too, selling the company I helped you build to your friends at Meridian." A long pause. "I don't know what you think you know, but I'd be careful about making accusations you can't substantiate." "Oh, I can substantiate them. I have documentation of your meetings with Peregrine Thorne dating back 14 months. I have Meridian's internal projections showing their acquisition timeline. I have evidence of the financial relationships between their private equity backers and your board members." Another pause, longer this time. When Orion spoke again, his voice had changed. The corporate smooth confidence was gone, replaced by something sharper and more dangerous. "What do you want, Amelia?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for since that devastating phone call on my wedding day. Everything I'd learned, every alliance I'd built, every piece of evidence I'd gathered had led to this conversation. "I want a meeting, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. at your office. Just you and me." Why would I agree to that? Because the alternative is that I release everything to federal investigators and financial media simultaneously. Your choice, Orion. Face me privately or face them publicly. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Finally, 10 a.m. But Amelia, this conversation ends badly for you either way. We'll see about that. After I hung up, my hands were shaking so badly I had to put the phone down. Daniel found me in our kitchen an hour later, staring out the window at the city below. "How did it go?" he asked. He agreed to meet. "Are you ready for this?" I thought about the evidence files in my briefcase, the SEC complaint ready to file, the journalists waiting for my call, and the prenup that gave me legal rights Orion still didn't understand. "I've been ready for this since the moment he destroyed my life," I said. "Tomorrow morning, Orion Crestwood learns what happens when you underestimate someone you trained to think strategically." Daniel kissed my forehead. "Just remember, you're not the same person who got fired 3 weeks ago. You're stronger now, more dangerous." He was right. The loyal, trusting employee who'd given 12 years of her life to Crestwood Industries was gone. In her place was someone who understood how power really worked, someone who'd learned to fight fire with fire. Tomorrow morning, Orion would face the woman he'd created when he chose to destroy me on my wedding day. He was going to discover that some people, when pushed to their breaking point, don't break. They become something far more dangerous. Friday morning, 9:58 a.m. I stood in the lobby of the Meridian Tower, the same building where I'd spent 12 years building Orion Crestwood's empire. The familiar marble floors and gleaming elevators looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. I was no longer the devoted employee rushing to another crisis meeting. I was a woman with a briefcase full of evidence that could destroy the man who'd tried to destroy me. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending to a battlefield. When the doors opened, Janet looked up from her desk with a mixture of sympathy and fear. "Amelia, you look different." I was different. The uncertain, shaken woman who'd been fired on her wedding day was gone. In her place stood someone who'd spent 3 weeks learning to think like a predator instead of prey, He's waiting for you, Janet said quietly. And Amelia? Be careful. He's not the same either. Orion's corner office hadn't changed. The same mahogany desk, the same view of Central Park, the same awards lining the walls. Awards for achievements I'd made possible. But the man behind the desk looked like he'd aged 5 years in 3 weeks. Amelia. He didn't stand or offer his hand. You look well for someone who's unemployed. I look like someone who's been productive with her time off. I sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited. You, on the other hand, look like someone who hasn't been sleeping well. His smile was razor thin. I've been busy finalizing some important business deals. Speaking of which, I trust this meeting won't take long. I have a board call in 30 minutes. Actually, that board call has been postponed. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Your board received some very interesting documents this morning. The color drained from Orion's face. What documents? SEC filing 21F3856, to be specific. A formal whistleblower complaint alleging securities fraud, market manipulation, and conspiracy to breach fiduciary duty. Filed at 8:47 a.m. this morning, with supporting evidence that took my forensic accountant 3 weeks to compile. Orion's hand moved toward his phone, but I continued talking. The complaint details how you and Meridian Strategic Group have been engaged in a coordinated scheme to defraud Crestwood Industries stakeholders for the past 18 months. How you provided Peregrine Thorne with proprietary operational data in exchange for below-market acquisition terms. How you systematically eliminated employees who might have exposed the conspiracy. You can't prove any of that. I pulled out a thick stack of papers. Actually, I can. This is Meridian's Q3 investor call transcript, where their CEO specifically mentions having, quote, internal intelligence about Crestwood's vulnerabilities. This is documentation of Peregrine Thorne's access to our client files 14 months before the acquisition was publicly announced. This is proof that Thomas Whitfield and Sarah Chen have received over $3.2 million in payments from Blackstone Capital while serving on our board. Orion's composure was cracking. Those are routine business relationships. These, I continued, pulling out another set of documents, are copies of your private communications with Meridian executives, dating back to January 2023. I particularly enjoyed the email where you described me as a potential obstacle that needs to be managed, and discussed the timing of my termination to coincide with the acquisition announcement. His face went white. How did you get access to your private communications? That's the beautiful thing about the prenuptial agreement I signed on my wedding day, Orion. It includes very specific provisions about financial disclosure and intellectual property rights. When you terminated me as part of a conspiracy to steal the value I'd created, you inadvertently gave me legal standing to demand access to any documents related to that theft. I leaned forward. Did you really think I'd spent 12 years learning corporate strategy from you without picking up a few skills? Orion stood up abruptly, walking to his window. What do you want, Amelia? I want you to understand what's happening to you. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen. At 9:15 this morning, the Wall Street Journal received exclusive access to the SEC filing and supporting documentation. Their story goes live at noon. At 9:30, the Financial Times received the same package. At 9:45, Bloomberg got their copy. His shoulders sagged. You're destroying the company. No, Orion. You destroyed the company the moment you decided to sell it to your friends for pennies on the dollar. I'm just making sure everyone knows what you did. I stood up and walked to his desk, spreading out more documents. Here's what's going to happen next. The SEC has already issued a temporary restraining order freezing all assets related to the Meridian acquisition. Your board meeting this afternoon isn't about accelerating the timeline anymore. It's about how to respond to federal fraud investigations. That's impossible. The SEC doesn't move that fast. They do when you hand them a conspiracy this blatant, with this much documentary evidence involving this much money. I smiled. They also move faster when the whistleblower's attorney happens to be married to someone with connections at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Orion spun around to face me. You can't do this. The non-disclosure agreement. The NDA you made me sign? That's void. Contracts signed under fraudulent pretenses have no legal standing. Plus, federal law protects whistleblowers from retaliation, including attempts to silence them through NDAs. For the first time since I'd known him, Orion Crestwood looked truly afraid. Amelia, we can work something out. Financial compensation, reinstatement, whatever you want. What I want is for you to understand how it feels to have everything you've built destroyed by someone you trusted. I gathered my documents and put them back in my briefcase. What I want is for you to experience the same shock I felt when you called me on my wedding day and threw away 12 years of my life with a 30-second phone call. This is revenge, not justice. No, Orion. Revenge would be destroying you personally for the satisfaction of watching you suffer. This is justice. This is ensuring that what you did to me can't happen to anyone else. I walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, and one more thing. Pinnacle Financial terminated their contract with Crestwood this morning. Apparently, Hestia Valley was very unhappy to learn that their strategic plans had been shared with competitors through your friend Peregrine Thorne. That's another $47 million in annual revenue you'll need to explain to whoever's left on your board. Wait. His voice was desperate now. What about the employees? The people who work here? If you destroy Crestwood, you're hurting innocent people. I turned back to face him. The employees will be fine. In fact, they'll probably be better off. You see, while you were busy selling the company to Meridian, I've been in discussions with 3 other strategic buyers who are very interested in acquiring Crestwood's assets through a proper process. Buyers who value the employees and want to maintain the company's culture rather than gutting it for parts. That's impossible. It's inevitable. By Monday morning, you'll have competing offers that value Crestwood at its actual worth, rather than the fire sale price you arranged with Meridian. The board will have a choice: accept a legitimate acquisition that benefits shareholders and employees, or face federal fraud charges for approving your sweetheart deal. Orion collapsed into his chair. How long have you been planning this? Since the moment you made the mistake of underestimating me. I opened the door to leave. You taught me everything I know about strategic thinking, Orion. You just never expected me to use those skills against you. Amelia, wait. Why are you doing this? We could have worked together. I always valued your contributions. I paused in the doorway, looking back at the man who'd once seemed so powerful, so untouchable. You valued my contributions so much that you fired me on my wedding day and tried to steal credit for 12 years of my work. You valued me so much that you threatened my husband's career to silence me. I was protecting the company. You were protecting yourself. There's a difference. I stepped into the hallway. Goodbye, Orion. Enjoy explaining to the federal investigators how a, quote, routine business relationship turned into securities fraud. As I walked past Janet's desk, she looked up with wide eyes. Is everything okay? Everything's perfect, I said. Oh, and Janet, you might want to start looking for a new job. I hear there are going to be some management changes around here. The elevator ride down felt like descending from a mountain after reaching the summit. I had done it. I'd looked the man who'd tried to destroy me in the eye and shown him exactly how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. When I reached the lobby, my phone buzzed with a text from Harrison. SEC confirmed. Full investigation launched. Meridian deal officially dead. You did it. Another text from Daniel. Saw the news alerts, so proud of you. Dinner tonight to celebrate? I walked out of the Meridian Tower, into the bright October morning, breathing deeply for the first time in weeks. The woman who'd been fired in disgrace 3 weeks ago was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, smarter, and far more dangerous to anyone who thought they could destroy her. Orion Crestwood had taught me well. Too well for his own good. The Wall Street Journal headline was everything I dreamed of. Crestwood Industries CEO Orion Crestwood faces federal fraud charges in $2.1 billion acquisition scandal. But it was the subheading that made me smile. Whistleblower exposes 18-month conspiracy hours before deal closure. It was Monday morning, 4 days after my confrontation with Orion, and I was sitting in my kitchen reading coverage of his complete downfall while Daniel made coffee. Every major financial publication had picked up the story, and the details were more damaging than even I had expected. "Listen to this," I told Daniel, reading from the Financial Times. Federal investigators described the scheme as one of the most blatant examples of corporate fraud in recent memory, with evidence suggesting Crestwood's leadership systematically deceived shareholders about the company's true value, while personally profiting from insider information. Daniel sat down beside me with our coffee. "Any word on what's happening to Orion personally?" I scrolled through my news alerts. The SEC froze all his assets pending investigation. The U.S. Attorney's Office is pursuing criminal charges. And this morning, Crestwood Industries Board voted unanimously to terminate him for cause, which means he forfeits all severance, stock options, and retirement benefits. How much money are we talking about? According to Bloomberg, his total compensation package was worth about $340 million if the Meridian deal had closed. Now he gets nothing, and he'll likely face criminal penalties that could include decades in prison. But the best news came in a call from Harrison Webb an hour later. "Amelia, the competing bids came in. You were right about other companies being interested in Crestwood's assets." I'd spent the weekend before my confrontation with Orion, reaching out to 3 major consulting firms that I knew had been watching Crestwood's growth with interest. I'd used my 12 years of industry relationships to set up preliminary discussions about a legitimate acquisition, one that would value the company properly and protect its employees. What are the numbers? Pinnacle Consulting Group offered $2.8 billion for the company and all assets. Sterling Strategic wants to merge operations and is offering $3.1 billion. But the best offer came from Meridian's biggest competitor. Blackwater Strategic Group is offering $3.4 billion, and they specifically want to retain all current employees with enhanced benefit packages. I felt a surge of satisfaction. So the employees are protected? Better than protected. Blackwater is offering retention bonuses to all staff and has committed to maintaining Crestwood's operational independence for at least 5 years. Your former colleagues aren't just keeping their jobs, they're getting promotions and raises. That afternoon, I got a call that validated everything I'd fought for. It was Kelvin Sterling, and for the first time since my wedding day, he sounded genuinely happy. "Amelia, I don't know how to thank you. When we heard about the competing bids, the whole office celebrated. People were crying with relief. What's the mood like there?" "Honestly, everyone's shocked at how close we came to disaster. If you hadn't exposed what Orion was doing, we would have been absorbed by Meridian, stripped for parts, and half of us would have been laid off within 6 months. And now? Now we're being courted by companies that actually value what we've built. Blackwater Strategic has already reached out to me about heading up their new East Coast division. It's a $200,000 raise in equity in a company that's growing instead of being gutted." Wednesday brought news that made the victory complete. Dahlia Hayes called, practically purring with satisfaction. "Amelia, darling, you've given me the most wonderful gift. The evidence you uncovered about Orion's financial planning for the acquisition has completely invalidated our divorce settlement." "How so?" "It turns out that while he was claiming poverty during our divorce proceedings, he was already negotiating deals that would have made him worth over $300 million. My lawyers are calling it the largest case of concealed assets they've ever documented." "What does that mean for you?" "It means I'm entitled to half of everything he would have received from the Meridian deal, plus penalties for fraud, plus recovery of attorney fees. We're talking about a $150 million settlement, minimum." But perhaps the most satisfying call came Thursday morning from Hestia Vale at Pinnacle Financial. "Amelia, I wanted to personally thank you for preventing what could have been a disaster for our company. If Meridian had acquired Crestwood with access to our proprietary strategies, the damage to our competitive position could have been enormous. I'm just glad we caught it in time." "More than in time. The board was so impressed with how you handled this situation that we'd like to discuss bringing you on as our new Chief Strategy Officer. The role comes with a $450,000 base salary, equity participation, and the opportunity to build out a new division focused on corporate intelligence and risk management." I was speechless. After weeks of uncertainty about my professional future, I was being offered a position that was not only more senior than my role at Crestwood, but more lucrative, and with a company that had specifically recruited me because of my strategic capabilities. We see this as an investment in preventing the kind of corporate fraud you just exposed, Hestia continued. Companies need executives who can identify and neutralize threats before they become existential crises. Friday afternoon, 1 week after my confrontation with Orion, I sat in the same coffee shop where I had first met with Kelvin to plan his role in exposing the conspiracy. But instead of planning an attack, I was celebrating a complete victory. Harrison joined me to review the final legal settlements. The SEC investigation is proceeding, but your whistleblower compensation has been approved. 22% of the total penalties recovered, which should amount to approximately $180 million once all the fines are calculated. $180 million? The SEC takes these cases very seriously, especially when the evidence is as comprehensive as what you provided. Orion and his co-conspirators are facing some of the largest corporate fraud penalties in recent history. I thought about the math. Between my whistleblower compensation, my new salary at Pinnacle Financial, and the intellectual property rights I'd secured through the Prenup litigation, I would be worth more than 10 times what I'd ever imagined during my years at Crestwood Industries. But the money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that I'd taken a man who thought he could destroy me with impunity and shown him that actions have consequences. I'd protected hundreds of innocent employees from corporate predators. I demonstrated that loyalty and dedication, when combined with strategic thinking and legal preparation, could defeat even the most ruthless opponents. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, "Dinner reservation at 8 p.m. to celebrate your new job. So proud of everything you've accomplished." As I walked home through Central Park, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in just 4 weeks. A month ago, I'd been a devoted employee who trusted that hard work would be rewarded. I'd been naive about corporate loyalty and believing in the goodness of powerful people. Now I was someone who understood that respect wasn't given. It was earned through strength. I'd learned that the only security came from being too valuable to lose and too dangerous to cross. Orion Crestwood had taught me that lesson by destroying me on my wedding day. It was the most expensive education he'd ever provided. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my new corner office at Pinnacle Financial Group, overlooking the Hudson River, and I can honestly say that getting fired on my wedding day was the best thing that ever happened to me. I know that sounds impossible. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that Orion Crestwood's betrayal would lead to the most successful period of my life, I would have thought they were insane. But as I look at my career now, Chief Strategy Officer at one of the most respected firms in New York, leading a team of 12 brilliant analysts, earning more money than I'd ever dreamed of, I realize that sometimes our greatest disasters become our greatest opportunities. The final chapter of Orion's story came last month. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison for securities fraud, conspiracy, and breach of fiduciary duty. His assets were liquidated to pay victims, including a $47 million settlement to Crestwood Industries' employee pension fund. The man who once seemed untouchable is now wearing a federal prison uniform and will likely spend the rest of his career behind bars. But this story isn't really about Orion's downfall. It's about what I learned about power, loyalty, and self-protection during the most difficult month of my life. The first lesson is that loyalty is only valuable when it's reciprocal. For 12 years, I gave everything to Crestwood Industries because I believed that dedication would be rewarded. I thought loyalty was a virtue that would protect me. Instead, I learned that one-sided loyalty is just exploitation in disguise. The people who deserve your loyalty are the ones who demonstrate loyalty to you, not with words, but with actions when it matters most. The second lesson is that you can't protect yourself by being indispensable. I thought that if I made myself valuable enough, if I solved every crisis and exceeded every expectation, I would be safe from corporate politics and betrayal. But the truth is that being indispensable can actually make you more vulnerable. When you know too much, when you're too important to the operation, you become a threat that needs to be managed. Real security comes from building your own power base, not from hoping that other people will value your contributions. The third lesson is about timing and preparation. The prenup that seemed like a meaningless formality when I signed it became the weapon that brought down $1 billion conspiracy. You never know when the documents you sign, the relationships you build, or the skills you develop will become crucial to your survival. Always read the fine print. Always understand your legal rights. Always be prepared for the possibility that the people you trust most will disappoint you. But the most important lesson is about transformation. The woman who got fired on her wedding day was someone who believed that the world was fundamentally fair, that hard work was always rewarded, and that powerful people could be trusted to do the right thing. That woman was naive, vulnerable, and ultimately disposable. The woman I became is someone who understands that fairness is something you create for yourself. That respect is earned through strength, not service. That the only person you can truly rely on is yourself, and the small circle of people who've proven their loyalty through actions, not words. This transformation didn't happen overnight. There were days during that month when I wanted to give up, to take whatever settlement Orion offered and disappear quietly. There were moments when the pressure from his lawyers, the threats to my marriage, and the uncertainty about my future felt overwhelming. But I learned something important about myself. When pushed to my breaking point, I don't break. I adapt. I learn. I become more dangerous. Daniel and I are stronger than ever. Going through that crisis together, seeing him support me unconditionally when my entire world was falling apart, taught us both what real partnership looks like. He didn't try to protect me from the battle. He helped me fight it. We make decisions together now, share everything, and trust each other completely because we've been tested under the worst possible circumstances. If you're watching this, and you're facing your own corporate betrayal, your own Orion Crestwood who thinks they can destroy you without consequences, I want you to know something. You're stronger than you think. You have more power than you realize. And sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing that could happen to you. Document everything. Understand your legal rights. Build relationships with people who share your values. Don't trust promises. Trust actions. And remember that loyalty is a two-way street. Most importantly, don't let anyone convince you that you should accept unfair treatment in the name of professionalism or moving on. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do is hold powerful people accountable for their actions. Sometimes the most productive way to move on is to ensure that what happened to you can't happen to someone else. The prenup I signed on my wedding day gave me rights I didn't know I had. But I only discovered those rights because I refused to accept that my story was over when Orion tried to end it. Your story isn't over either. Whatever betrayal you're facing, whatever powerful person is trying to silence you, whatever corporation is trying to steamroll you, you have more options than you think. You just have to be brave enough to explore them. These spirit as more. Lori has inspired you, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they can fight back and win. Let me know in the comments if you faced similar situations. Your story might help someone else find their courage. Remember, powerful people aren't untouchable. They just want you to think they are. Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough or angry enough to prove them wrong. Thank you for watching, and remember, never underestimate someone who's been underestimated their entire life. We might just surprise you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.